Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about my process, my practice, but more specifically, my approach to typography. So I'm going to start all the way at the beginning and talk about my influences. Oh, there we go. So, as many people as a child were probably into Dragon Ball Z. I was as well. Was very obsessed with the show as a kid. But looking back, you know, I was trying to understand, kind of why was I obsessed with this show? Was it the action? Was it the story? But I remembered that I was always drawing these characters, and I was drawing my own characters. And the thing I was always doing, though, was I was obsessed with their clothing and their pants. And the more wrinkles I could add to their pants, the cooler the character was, the more powerful the character was, in my opinion. And it's that sort of idea of excess and what excess can relate to sort of details that I see transferred to what I do today as a designer. But that idea of details and excess also translates to another influence of mine as a kid, which was Warhammer, which is a tabletop game. I remember going into comic book shops as a little kid, seeing these tables in the back of the shop with all these like armies on there, and just obsessed with the craftsmanship that went into this. If you're not familiar with Warhammer, they're these little, like no bigger than 1.5 inches tall figures. But you have to paint them. So the idea that someone is sitting there with, a single bristle paintbrush painting these figures was just mind-blowing to me. And again, to do this dozens and dozens of times to create this army, the passion and dedication that went into that, I was just obsessed with. And then as a teenager, that idea of passion and dedication led me to hardcore punk, and more specifically, the do-it-yourself ethics of the punk scene. A lot of these bands were just teenagers such as I, and they weren't signed to these big record labels with huge budgets. It was just them and their money and resources that they had to produce their music and share it with the world. They weren't the most talented people. They could barely play their instrument. In fact, they could barely play their own songs. But again, that passion, that dedication to make art and to share it with the world, this idea that you can be an amateur and still make impactful work. And it also, though, translated to the packaging of these records, whether it was they didn't have computers and stuff back in the 90s. So it was, handwritten and Xeroxed and screen printed or using a typewriter. I've even seen some that were wrapped in aluminum foil. But it was this idea of just doing whatever is necessary to share your work. But that also leads to the live setting of these bands. They were playing in people's basements, in their living rooms, sometimes to an audience of 1, sometimes to an audience of 10. These weren't crowded shows or in big clubs or stadiums with thousands of people. But to me, seeing these shows, you see so many people invested in the music and also in their community. And that's a big thing that has translated also to me now as a designer is, you look at ad agencies and marketing campaigns and tech companies and all this shit, and it's, if it doesn't speak to thousands, if not millions of people, it's considered unsuccessful. But to me, it's like that doesn't, you're not building any sense of community there. So what I've kind of taken from this again is that if I'm just connecting to one person, I consider what I've done a success. And then lastly, at the end of my teenage years, I got into black metal. Black metal is a very toxic genre of music, but I think it's a it encompasses all the things I've been talking about up to this point, as far as excess and details and community and all that kind of stuff, the do-it-yourself ethics, but it's pushed to the extreme. And these bands are making music that sounds like it was recorded in a toilet, and they have all these personas and aliases. They dress up and make up and all this stuff, all in the name of being evil. But 99% of the time, it comes across very dorky and very goofy. But to me, I find that very fascinating. This a fine line on a spectrum, and balancing that fine line. Are you tipping into success, or are you tipping into dorkiness and cheesiness and tackiness? But to me, that fine line is a moment of friction that I try to capture in my own work. And that friction is, it's meant, at least I think, it's meant to arouse a sense of consciousness within an audience. A lot of work that designers make, it's mindless. It's mindless for a designer to make. It's mindless for an audience to digest. And then we wonder as designers, oh, why do clients give boring feedback and tell us these dumb things? They must be dumb as people. They're not dumb as people. We as designers have been feeding them these boring ass things for decades now. Of course, this is now what they consider good design. And it's those rules, right? These things that have been, these ideas of less is more and simplicity and minimalism, all that stuff. It was made by old white men in the 60s and 70s, even before that. It goes back to the Bauhaus. I mean, have we not learned anything in the year 2022 that those people do not speak for all of us? So as far as I'm concerned, those rules are there to, if anything, keep the status quo and keep these ideas of oppression, whether we realize it or not. So to me, I'm making what I call entanglements or interzones. And I want audiences to slow down. I want them to sort of have to chop their way through these, thickets of a jungle or something to make their own path, and to discover and to define and ask questions about what they are looking at. So how do I create these things? One method is filters. I find it funny that, design leaders and so forth tell us, oh, don't use drop shadows, don't use filters, all this stuff. But to me, I'm thinking, well, these things were made, they're in the programs we use every day. Certainly they must have a purpose, and they do. Not all of these are worth using, but if you have some sort of intention, some sort of concept, these things can help you create that. And as you've seen, in that past example, what I try to do is I try to take these images that either I create or that already exist, and I try to decay them with this high contrast black and white, almost Xerox look, Xeroxing coming again from like punk and black metal, all that. But it's all done within these programs here. It takes hours. It's not like it's a simple click and it's done. It takes a very long time to do. But my point is by decaying an image, I do also try to leave some sort of resemblance to the past thing that I'm decaying, something that someone can recognize and identify. But then the rest of the image being decayed, that to me is a moment for people to sort of reassess who they are, where they are, and just kind of, tap into their desires a little bit. So I'm going to break this down looking at this poster here that I made for a goth post-punk party. So if we look at the typography, I think it's important to understand that if you're going to design extremes, you also need to show the other end of that spectrum, which is the rudimentary. So in this case, the way this was made was with a classic serif font as the base, and then layered on top of it are these German open source script fonts I found. And again, the serif is the rudimentary part of it. The German script fonts are the extreme part of it. But when I run it through that filter algorithm and I'm messing around for hours, eventually, these two moments start to bleed into each other and influence each other and manipulate each other until you get the final result on the right. Looking at another little digital flyer here for some two DJs. This didn't really have a concept, and it was just kind of, they were like, hey, can you just make this thing that promotes our concert? I'm like, yeah, sure. So looking at this, again, the foundation is just a bunch of text boxes in Illustrator and vector shapes, black and white, nothing fancy. But I start going into these different, menus and panels within these programs that either I'm not familiar with or I haven't touched in a while. And I just start applying it to what I have composed here. I kind of treat the canvas as if I'm a painter, and I just make something beautiful, and then I apply rules or, again, effects or whatever to it afterwards. So in this case, it was a menu in Illustrator, the stroke style menu. I don't even know what the hell it's called, but we're going to go with stroke style. And it does, all these different widths. Okay. Again, run it through that algorithm multiple times, different forms of layering and so forth. And you get this final result that looks, distressed, a little bit of lighting added to it. Nice and fun. Here's another example, same thing. Here's stock photography of splintered wood. Why splinter wood? Couldn't tell you. Probably thought it was going to look cool. And the result on the right, I don't know, it's kind of cool. Another example, again, these are just vector shapes, nothing fancy. But over time, I get different results. And a lot of times I can't decide on what result I want. So in something like this, I just layered them all on top of each other. And here again, we have a sort of entanglement or interzone of all these things working together and having the viewer kind of really dissect what they're looking at. Another example, this I think is kind of great, where the other one I was saying how kind of treat the canvas as if I was a painter, right? And I just kind of make something from the outset. This is actually different parts all assembled together. I think it's important, things that we throw into the pasteboard of Illustrator or InDesign, or just like scraps, are worth exploring a little bit. Just see what can happen to them. So here was different typography. Here was a layout. This came out of it, this like halftone pattern unexpectedly, because this sort of algorithm does have a little bit of a mind of its own. But I was like, oh man, I wasn't expecting that. I think that's kind of cool. I like what it did to their names. And so I apply it to the whole thing. Again, this took hours to actually apply it, but it becomes a texture for that background type, but it also deforms the lettering of that background type as well. This was something I did recently. I'm teaching this elective class at Pratt right now. Pratt asked me to make this little promotion thing. But honestly, I can't tell you how I made this, but I can tell you it started again with black and white vector type and just hours and hours of crafting it over and over again, trying different things I'm not familiar with. And eventually you latch on to something and it leads to something like this that looks 3D. It looks like it was photographed in motion. And really, it's just a bunch of flat vector letters. So another piece of my practice is using typography as a means of sketching. I've worked on projects that I just find boring or I'm just frustrated with. And I just start messing around with the type to see, where can it take me? The great thing about, these digital tools that we have is, as far as thinking of it as sketching, you have the undo button. You know, it's not clay, it's not paint, it's not graphite. You can undo what you're doing. It's not precious. So a lot of times I'm just kind of doing something, hitting undo, doing something, hitting undo, until again, I find something to latch onto and I just push it and push it and push it to that extreme. And then sometimes I think it's worthwhile to turn into an entire alphabet and make a font out of it that can be used. And I make them open source and I share them on my website. With them being open source, they're free to use, free to download, and free to expand upon and customize. And because of that, I mean, if we look at these, I mean, they look like trash, right? Like who the hell is gonna, I barely even use them, and I made them. But people from all over the world have used these fonts. I mean, they've been used on a 100 gecs tour poster. They've been used on websites. They've been used for logos, used on band merch, artist merch. They've even been used by It's Nice That for the titles of their articles. And I'm not showing these to brag about this. What I'm trying to say about this is this goes back to the punk shows and playing for an audience of 1 or 10 or just something small. Again, the fonts are a mess. They look terrible. They're not even like perfect as far as like kerning and all that stuff that goes into like proper type design. I don't do any of that. But people were seeking something. They were seeking a certain aesthetic, a certain vibe. They found these, they used them. And designers that I would never have the confidence to DM or email myself are instead talking to me. And so the point of this is, you know, type can be more than just something that's like a beautiful thing that we, you know, put on posters or whatever. It can be a tool to passively network. And that kind of goes into another project I did for this gallery, 321 Gallery here in Brooklyn, New York. In fact, they might be closed now because of the pandemic. But this was an artist-run gallery. It was also run out of one of the director's apartments. So the front of his apartment was the gallery, and then the back was his living space. But you could come in and, you know, he would invite you back for a cup of tea or something in his living room. But the point is that as an artist-run gallery, you know, everyone has a say in what, you know, an exhibition should be at this space. And I was really trying to capture that in the identity for it. And I thought the logo would be the perfect kind of thing to really express that. If you see those two sort of shifting rectangles there, that's the floor plan of the gallery. And I basically made the logo kind of fit the corners of that floor plan. But I work with the artists, or I used to, again, they closed, but I used to work with these artists to make the logo an extension of their practice or of their work. Again, I want typography to be this thing where people say, oh, I worked with Rory to create this, right? And that everyone had a say in this as a means of representation for who they are, what they're trying to do, and what they're trying to say. This was a album cover for this artist named Massive Music. They are this like hard drum, techno, I don't know, something like that. Basically, the label and the artist came to me and they were like, here, it's called Massive Music, figure it out. And I was like, okay. So I just kind of went with my instincts and, you know, to me, what was massive? And the first thing was brutalist architecture, you know, big, heavy, thick slabs of concrete juxtaposed together to create something. That influenced what the typography would be. And then I was like, okay, what else is like massive and floor stomping outside in nature? And I was like, a rhino. So I just took a rhino and their skin, that became a texture. You put the two together, you get something fun. But then later they were like, hey, love the rhino. We want to make shirts though, but we don't want to put the cover on the shirt. So can you kind of extend that idea? And I went back to, again, some sketches, some scraps, things that were not chosen. And I really loved this border I made, which was actually more typography that spelled out massive music in an abstract way. And I thought, I really want to use this. I don't want this to just be a scrap that no one ever sees. And I talked to my friend, Brendan Lovejoy, who's an illustrator. And I said, how can we make this type feel like a rhino? And we came up with, let's just take the anatomy of a rhino, their bones, their feet, the horn, all that stuff, and exaggerate it so that those individual pieces of anatomy feel massive. Another conceptual thing here was something I did at Cranbrook, which is where I went to grad school, and also where Zhao went. And about a dozen, maybe less, of us organized a symposium to be held on the Cranbrook campus. What we wanted to do was we wanted to make a pipeline between Cranbrook and Detroit. We wanted artists, political activists, organizers, things like that, to be able to come to Cranbrook and have a connection with the school. So we made this symposium of sorts. We held lectures, workshops, dinners even within this bubble. It was for 3 days and 3 nights. Why a bubble? Couldn't tell you. Probably just, I don't even remember. I think we just were like, it's cool. It's something we could build, which we did. In fact, we built 2 of these bubbles. And yeah, it was just cool. But we had to promote it. So I collaborated with another friend of mine, Lucas Albrecht, on these. And we were like, okay, the sort of iconic thing of this space, especially to an outsider, someone, from the public coming here, is this bubble. They're going to see this bubble on this historic campus and be like, well, obviously that's where I need to walk to, that's where the symposium is. So if architecture was our base, we were trying to find something typographic within there. And if you're not familiar, architects, I don't know if they still do this, but I feel like for decades they did. There was a certain handwriting that they used, all of them. They all had to learn it, and they used it on their floor plans. So we took that as the foundation, and we were like, let's just make it bubbly. And again, turned it into a font, put it all over these posters with just inside some bubbly shapes. You got something fun. This one was actually kind of a different form of being conceptual. This was for a poster for an artist talk for Joshua Ray Stevens, who's an illustrator and comic artist. And he kind of had some various styles. They weren't crazy different, but there was various styles to how he was drawing things. And I just kind of was like, I don't know how to represent all of this. But I was just looking at how he was drawing, and there was a textural quality to it. I was like, okay, let me just tap into that and push that to the extreme. And then I made this illustration. It's not even his work. It's something I made. But I applied that texture to that and the typography. Again, pushed it to the extreme. Got something cool. But at a certain point when I was coloring this, I had made the top black and white layer invisible and found the underpainting to be quite beautiful. And again, this is a moment where the scraps and things that you think aren't worthwhile or things that you just weren't noticing at first can be something worth pursuing either in that moment or at a later date. This is another poster. This was an open call for a gallery for a show they were doing called Performance by Proxy. And I had no idea what the hell a proxy was. Even after looking up the definition, I still don't know what the hell it is. But to me, it was something about swapping, identities or something. Who knows? But I ran with it. And I basically took the letters PROXY, proxy. I took it out of the text, flipped it, swapped it, did all this stuff to it. So that at first glance, right, someone's going to look at this and be like, oh my God, this is a mess. I can't read this. But you take one extra second with it and you realize it's just one simple gesture and it is legible and it is worth reading. Another poster for an artist. This was for Paul Pfeiffer. And some of his work, you know, he'll take like something like a photograph of a basketball game and he'll erase the entire audience so that all that's left is like a player like dunking. So I took that idea of erasing and I found a bunch of headshots of him and I erased him out of the headshots with this texture. But I applied that same idea to the typography at the bottom there, where I removed letters. So Paul Pfeiffer, I tried to remove as many letters as I could that it was still, you know, when you like set it or something, you could still get what is being written here. Same with the month below it, April 24th. I was like, April, PRL are pretty unique letters compared to other names of the month. I think people are going to get it. 24, 6 p.m. And then DeSalle Auditorium. You know, the audience for this was students at Cranbrook. They know that all artist talks are in DeSalle. I can obviously remove a whole bunch of letters there so that it's just barely legible. But this can also translate to the web. This is a website I did for an artist and choreographer, Alexa West. And I really wanted to, one, highlight the artwork and the performances. But I was also trying to figure out how can the type sort of reflect what's happening in all these different performances. And I thought, oh, it'd be interesting to kind of have this effect where the type comes in and out, you know, as almost like a disappearing of body parts or something as a person moves. And you as a viewer in one position, you know, may not be able to see what's happening in a performance. So yeah, that was it, hiding and revealing. This was another book for a designer, Swati Pipersanya. She makes these pretty weird objects that try to bring people together. And basically, we're like, okay, Swati, you make objects. Let's make this book feel like an object and not like a book. So this is actually flat, even though it's bound down the middle, the book lays flat. And then you obviously can open pages here, but I'm going to try and explain this and it's going to make zero sense, but just bear with me. As you can see, my name is there, the first one, Rory King. I wrote the foreword. And you have that line, right? The first sentence there. But that sentence goes from spread to spread across the entire book until it wraps around the back cover and then it dips down and then it goes again through the book as one line, comes back around, dips down. And that happens for all the essays like that. But then as we were looking at it, we were like, okay, well, it doesn't make sense, right? If my essay's the first one and Taryn is the last essay, it doesn't make sense that both essays would be on page 15 of the book. So we came up with this idea that the width of the page here would identify a page. So, you know, there's that one right above the first word in my essay. And every time that then identified that spacing across the whole book. So you see these numbers, they're in different spots throughout the whole book. But that represents a page. So that you can say, oh, Swati's essay on page 70. And you can just find the number 70 and you know where to begin. But as you can see, when essays sort of end in the middle of the book it just becomes negative space for the rest of the book until you wrap around to the front of the book. This was another book I did between my first and second year of grad school. I had all these essays about thoughts I had. They weren't fully developed. Some of the thoughts were just kind of like whatever. But as I was rereading them, I realized there was a lot of overlap, and a lot of these were influencing each other. So I was like, let me just treat all these essays as if they were just one body of text in a book. So it is typeset in a way where, you know, it almost looks like run-on sentences between all these things, but there is structure to it, even though it's random on every page. And the best way to read this are those decorative lines that circle the last word in a passage on that page, and then they take you over to the next page to the first word of that passage. And then again, it repeats, it finds the last word, brings you over to the next page, and it does that throughout the entire book. And again, when new essays appear later, they're still just jumbled amongst all this stuff. And so the last one here is this book I did for an artist and painter, Alyssa Clower. And she came to me, this was for a solo show. She had a gallery to make this catalog. And she came to me and she was like, I'm just kind of like obsessed with diaries. And I was like, okay, cool. And I ran with that, and I just kind of went literal with it. I was looking at, you know, different diaries and journals on Google Images, just trying to identify the structure of how those booklets look and those notebooks look. And any sort of language, I just swapped out for the language we needed for this catalog. So up at the top there, where that like heart is, you know, it says statement, interview, works, and appendix. Those are the sections of the book. Or here with the envelopes, right? I'm using those symbols as a stamp to identify what section we are in within the book, in the same way that some kid would, you know, circle or stamp their own journal to identify something. And at the same time, the page numbers kind of became, instead of a date, you know, a big, you know, whatever, January 20th, you know, like instead of a big number there, I used the page number to replace it. But I turned the page here, or the spread, into a quadrant, right? As if you could get 4 days worth of journal entries on a spread. And I used those quadrants to place the text. So there was an interview in the beginning of the book. Each question and answer had its own quadrant. But it translates also into the artwork section. And again, this moment allows a variety within the book so that I'm not doing the same thing over and over and over again. This helps to, again, just add a little moment of variety, a little bit of spice to keep the reader interested as they go through the book. So I'm going to end here on something a little weird, but hopefully it makes sense. If you're not familiar, these two screenshots are from a game called Final Fantasy VII. The one on the left is the original game made in 1997, and the one on the right is the remake that was made 2 years ago or something. But to me, the one on the left, I think, is the more success, or the one on the left is the one I think is more successful, in that I think it represents the same kind of work that I'm doing. It forces the viewer, the reader, the user, the gamer, whatever the audience is, to have to invest in the actual visuals, and they have to put themselves into it. And they have to fill in the missing pieces. And they have to interpret actions and emotions and questions and things like that within the work. And again, that's, you know, when we think of modernism, which is basically the basis of all of graphic design, it's this dogma that's based on this pursuit of clarity, certainty, and purity. But those things, and I mentioned it before, they don't represent the world that we live in, and they don't represent us as people. Um, again, they are principles to maintain the status quo. We live in a very chaotic world. So again, to me, represent that chaos. Sure, the one on the right here, the remake, looks beautiful, but it is what it is, right? And I can't put myself within it. That is the character. Where the one on the left, as a little kid when I played it, I saw myself as this character going through this entire game and the whole story and everything like that. So again, as a designer, I'm not trying to end conversations or to speak for other people. And no one and no thing in this world is perfect. Again, we live in a chaotic world. So the work that I make, there's these intentional cracks in the foundation. There are moments for people to insert themselves into it, to see themselves into it, and to place themselves into it, to really slow down and kind of have tangential thoughts that extend from what I'm making. And it's a moment for them to understand who they are and where they are. And to me, that is what design should be about. So thank you.